Hello. Today we're going to talk about firms and their decisions in the short run. This video is going to follow Chapter 8, Cost and the Changes at Firms Over Time in Taylor and Virapana. I'm going to focus on the first half of the chapter, the half that deals with the short run. Before we begin, I'm going to do a quick recap of Chapter 6, which today's video is building on. You can go back and look over your notes or watch Lecture 17, The Behavior of Firms, to remember the details of what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, since we're going to be talking about firms, first thing to remember is that we treat in this course a firm just like a production function that takes capital and labor and turns these two kinds of inputs into some output. And Q stands for just the amount of output that the firm is producing, and K and L stand for the amount of capital and labor that the firm is hiring to produce that output. Second, to make things as simple as possible, we say that the objective of a firm is to maximize profits. And profit is the difference between total revenue, that is the receipts that the firm gets from selling the product, and the total cost it has to pay to produce. And because there are two kinds of inputs, capital and labor, that total cost can additionally split into two costs. Think of total cost as either cost of capital, because that's one of the inputs, and the other input being labor, that's also going to be cost of labor. Another thing that I did in video 17, I distinguished between the short run and the long run. And I said that in the short run, at least one input factor is fixed, and usually it is the capital that is fixed. Whereas in the long run, all factors of production are variable. So in the short run, we can think of costs associated with capital, cost of capital as the fixed cost, and cost of labor as the variable cost, because you can relatively easily hire and fire workers, but changing the amount of capital, that is moving in and out of a facility or getting new equipment, renting it or buying it, usually takes time, and it's not that easy to adjust the amount of capital that you have. In the long run, everything is adjustable, and so there are no fixed costs. So another way of thinking about profit in the short run is to look at it as the difference between the total revenue of the company, its fixed cost of hiring capital, and the variable cost of hiring labor. This is the short run decomposition. Finally, given that the objective is to maximize profits, we also know what the profit maximizing condition is. Using marginal analysis, we can say that a firm should produce to the extent that the marginal revenue from producing the last unit equals the marginal cost of its production. And that applies to any firm under any condition. Marginal revenue has to equal to marginal cost. And then, depending on the situation, marginal revenue has different representation. The situation that we have been looking in the last several videos, and the situation that I'm going to focus on today, is a situation of a price-taking firm, a firm that operates under competitive conditions. And in these conditions, no matter how many units you're going to sell, the price for your output is going to be the same. So a firm that is a price taker has marginal revenue equals to the price, and so the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost condition simplifies to price equal to the marginal cost. The market price at which you're able to sell any amount you produce is your marginal revenue, and your marginal cost is the usual marginal cost that you've seen before. So that was for the recap. As for today, I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, I want to give you a picture of what the difference is between the short run and the long run, how to understand that better. Next, I'm going to talk about three kinds of costs. So we talked about total costs and we talked about marginal costs. We need to add average costs. And finally, we're going to look into more detail into firms' decisions in the short run. You know, part of that decision-making process compare price to the marginal cost, but the second part would be whether to produce at all or to shut down. So let's move on to the first part, short run versus long run. So here's the idea. We understand a short run as a period of time during which the amount of capital that the firm has is fixed, whereas labor can be adjusted. Think about this. Suppose that all the capital that you need is just a building for your factory or for your farm. So when you rent a building, there is a particular amount of time for which you rent it. And during that amount of time, getting out of a lease and moving into a different building is quite costly. So you're usually committed to a particular building for the duration of the lease. So the short run is determined by the duration of the length of time during which you are committed to a particular amount of capital. And then once that time period is over, you can say, okay, I'm doing okay, I'm going to stay in this building, or I need to expand, I need to move into a larger building, or I need to scale down, I need to move into a smaller building. And so this is when you're going to adjust your capital. And once your capital is adjusted, you lock yourself into a new short-run period during which your capital is going to be fixed. So basically, the distinction between the short run and the long run is the distinction between how easy it is to adjust labor. You hire and fire people relatively easily compared to capital, and how difficult it is to adjust capital. So every time you lock yourself into a particular amount of capital, you're in the short run. Then you can change the amount of capital, and then you're going to get into a short run as well. So this is the short run situation. What is the long run? The long run is the sequence of short runs, basically. Every time you decide how your business is going to operate over time, you lock yourself into some short run decisions, but in the long run, ultimately, you can get it. Long run ultimately is long enough that you can change capital as well. So the idea of the long run is just looking at the sequence of the short run decisions. And when we say that capital is variable in the long run, that simply means that we're looking at long enough periods of time that you can adjust the amount of capital available to you. That is the whole story. And this is the picture that I want you to have in your minds when you think about the difference between the short run and the long run. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the three kinds of costs. So far, you know what total costs are. In video 17, I showed you how to derive total costs by looking at the production function, by figuring out how much it costs to produce a particular level of output, at least in the short run when capital is fixed. Then we already looked at marginal costs. These costs are defined as cost of producing an additional unit of output. And in the example that I'm going to show you next, I'm going to show you how to calculate marginal costs given a total cost schedule. And the next thing that that is going to be new for today is the idea of average costs. So we're going to look at the per unit costs of production. And we need marginal costs to decide the optimal level of output. Remember that for figuring out the maximum profit or the maximum utility for the consumer, we use marginal incremental values to determine what that optimal level should be. So same reason why we need to compare marginal cost to the price to determine what the profit maximizing level of output is. Average costs, on the other hand, we need to use to decide whether to produce or to shut down. So comparing average cost against the price will tell us whether a company is making profit or losses and how big those losses are or how big those profits are and what the optimal thing to do is. So given the market price, the company has to decide two things. Whether to produce or to shut down, and if it were to produce, how much to produce. Now, let's look at a simple toy example, not particularly realistic, just let's look at a table and try to calculate different kinds of costs of this table. So here's that example. The output is in the first row, and for each level of output, there is a corresponding total cost. And I want to point out the difference. When we're talking about consumers' decisions, we always start with Q equal to 1. Should the consumer buy the first unit? Should the consumer then buy the second unit? And so on. When we're looking at the firms, we start with Q equal to 0 because there is this assumption that even if the firm isn't producing anything at all, it's still incurring some costs. And so to incorporate that idea into the framework, we start with Q equal to 0. So total costs are positive even if the firm doesn't produce anything. This is the idea of, well, you have to rent capital no matter what. And the first two things that I'd like to do is I'd like to calculate the marginal cost and the average cost from the total cost schedule. And so you're already familiar with the concept of marginal cost. This is the increase in total cost that is associated with an increase in output by 1. So suppose that we start with 0 and we want to ask yourself, how much more do we need to pay to produce the first unit of output? And if we're producing the first unit of output, if Q equals to 1, we are increasing our total cost from 90 to 100, and so the marginal cost would equal the difference between the two, that is $10. So you need to pay an additional $10 to produce the first unit of output. How much do you need to pay to produce the second unit of output? Your costs increase from 100 to 120, so you're paying an additional $20 for the second unit of output. For the third unit, your costs increase from 120 to 150, that is by 30, and for the fourth, they increase by 40. So marginal costs are 10 for the first, 20 for the second, 30 for the third, 40 for the fourth in this example. And notice that the standard assumption is that marginal costs are increasing. So the more units you want to produce, the higher is the cost of producing an additional units. And this usually stems for a more basic assumption on the production function that any company is using. Marginal costs usually are increasing, or at least not decreasing, because marginal product of labor is usually decreasing. Companies tend to hire most productive labor first, leaving less productive labor in the marketplace for longer. And in addition to that, the more and more people you hire, the less and less productive the additional person that you're hiring is, because, well, you have to divide the tasks between more and more people, and your amount of capital is fixed. So at one point, people will just be waiting their turn to use a computer or a machine or to do whatever. So it's the first unit of labor that's most productive and the first unit of output that costs you the less in terms of the marginal cost. And then labor becomes less productive, marginal costs correspondingly increase, and this is the usual picture. Another picture that we might see in the future is the situation when marginal cost is just constant. And that is also common. But for now, assume that marginal product is decreasing and marginal cost is increasing. That's it about marginal cost. Now let's switch and calculate average cost. How do we do that? To calculate the average cost, we need to take total cost, which is the second row in our table, and divide it by the number of units produced. So basically, if this is how much it costs to produce one unit, then the per unit cost is going to be 100 divided by 1, just 100. So the first unit costs $100 to produce total, and that will be the average cost of the first unit. Now, when I'm looking at how much it costs per unit to produce 2 units, well, the total cost of 2 units is 120, so per unit it's going to be 120 divided by 2, just 60. For 3 units, it's going to be 150 divided by 3, $50. For the fourth one, it's going to be 190 divided by 4, 47.5. So to calculate the average cost of production, I'm using a simple formula. I take the total cost for a particular number of units and divide by that number of units. So 120 over 2, 150 over 3, 190 over 4, and so on. That is the idea of the total cost. Now let's see what happens to the total cost, to the average cost over time. Marginal cost is increasing, but the average cost in this example is decreasing. The first unit, its average cost is 100. When we produce 2, per unit cost is 60. When we produce 3, per unit cost is 50. What is going on here? Well, think about the following. When, for example, let's start with the first unit. When we're producing just one unit, producing the additional second unit only costs us $20. So the first unit costs $100 to produce, including all the costs associated with production. But when we're throwing the second unit, we're only increasing the cost of production by $20. So clearly, the average has to fall because it's the average between 100 and 20, so it has to be below 100. And this is why the average cost of producing 2 falls. Now you're producing 2 units of output at $60 each, and the third one comes at 30. So you have 60, 60, and 30. The average cost of 3 has to be then above 30, but below 60, and 50 is the right amount using the formula. Now you have 3 units, each of them costs 50, and the fourth unit only costs 40. So the average for the 4 has to be the average of 3 times 50 and 40 divided by 4, still under 50. So the general rule is as follows. When marginal cost is below average cost, so for example, marginal cost of the second unit is below the average cost of producing 1 unit, marginal cost of the third is below average cost for 2, average cost would be decreasing because we increase output by 1, but this last unit produced costs cheaper than it cost us on average to produce all the previous units. So then the average has to decrease as well. And so when marginal cost is below average cost has to be decreasing. If marginal costs were above average cost, then the average cost has to be increasing. So basically, average cost follows the lead of the marginal cost. And the consequence of this observation is that when average costs are minimized, marginal costs and average costs have to be the same. So this is an important fact, and we will use it at some point later, I think when we talk about the firm's decisions in the long run. So that's it about the marginal cost and the average cost. To calculate the marginal cost, again, look at the difference between 2 neighboring total costs. To calculate the average cost, look at the total cost and divide it by the output. That is the difference between the two. Let's move on and let's expand this table and fill in more detail. So here's the same table, well, at least the same starting point. Output from 0 to 4, total cost from 90 to 190, and we've calculated, I'm carrying over the average cost. I'm not looking at marginal costs now, but what I want to do is, if we're in the short run, I want to split the total cost into fixed cost and variable cost, and once I do that, I want to calculate average cost per unit of the fixed cost and average per unit cost of the variable cost. So this will be the 2 new averages. But the way to calculate averages is exactly the same. Take the cost value and divide it by the number of units produced. How to solve this puzzle, if you think of it as a kind of a crossword puzzle? What about the fixed cost? Fixed cost is the part of the cost that does not depend on the output. And that fixed cost appears in the total cost when no output is produced whatsoever. So if you have to pay $90 even if you're not producing any output at all, that means that your fixed cost is $90. And that even when you're producing the first unit, you're still paying that $90 of the fixed cost. With 2, it's still 90. So fixed cost is the constant part of your expenditures, and you can usually find it by looking at how much it costs to not produce anything, how much it simply costs to run your business without any output. So the fixed cost is 90. Then what can we say about the rest? What is the difference between total cost and fixed cost? It has to be attributed to production, so it's going to be the variable cost. And so the variable cost is total cost minus fixed cost. So 90 minus 90 is 0 for the first unit, 0 for the no units at all, 10 for the first unit, 30, 60, and 100. Let's see if that's the next line, next row in the table. That is the variable cost. That is the cost of labor versus the fixed cost of capital. But now we can also calculate for our output how much per unit it costs to use capital and how much per unit it costs to use labor. And this is what average fixed costs and average variable costs respectively stand for. So for the average fixed costs, we need to calculate how this fixed cost of 90 is divided between the output. And clearly when we calculate averages, we can't say anything about 0 because we can't divide by 0. But for 1, the fixed cost of 90 is completely attributed to 1 unit of output, so the average is just going to be 90. For 2, it's the same fixed cost divided between 2 units, so the average fixed cost is 45. For 3, it's 90 divided by 30 by 3, so $30. For 4, 90 divided by 4. So average fixed costs are always decreasing because we just take a fixed amount and divide it between larger and larger number of units produced. For the variable cost, it's not exactly, there's no such distinct rule as to how they should behave. But so the variable costs in this story are increasing, and so are the average variable cost. The variable cost of 10 for the first unit, so 10 divided by 1 is 10. The variable cost for 2 is 30, so 30 divided by 2 is 15, 60 divided by 3 is 20, 100 divided by 4 is 25. So to get the average variable cost, you first need to find the variable cost, and then you need to divide it by the number of units produced. So averaging works the same no matter what kind of costs you're looking at. And the final thing to remember is because fixed cost and variable cost together give you the total cost, average fixed cost and average variable cost together should give you the average cost. So for example, average fixed cost of 2 is 45, average variable cost of 2 is 15, the total is 60. And so to check yourself, always make sure that the sum of AFC, average fixed cost, and average variable cost equals average cost in general. Next, let's look at a firm's decision in the short run. And so I'm going to use the example that I used in the previous section talking about the different kinds of costs. And I'm going to make a slightly different table. Let's see. I'm going to have the total costs, the marginal costs, the average costs, and average variable costs. So I don't need to look at fixed costs and variable costs in detail any longer. I just need these 4 kinds of costs. And so the example goes as follows. Suppose that the market price is 35. What should the firm do? How much should it produce, if at all? Well, the first step, and your instinct should tell you that this is what should be done no matter what. Look at the marginal cost. Price of 35 is your marginal benefit of production. So compare the marginal benefit of production with the marginal cost of production and see how many units it would be best to produce in order to maximize your profits. First unit costs 10, earns 35, should be produced. Second unit costs 20, earns 35, should be produced. Third unit costs 30, earns 35, should be produced. Fourth unit costs 40, earns 35, should not be produced. So the answer here is produce 3 units. Now let's calculate how much profit the firm is going to make when 3 units are produced. The profits are price times quantity. So it will sell 3 units, the price of 35, that is 35 times 3, it's going to earn $105. It's going to spend $150 on production, so it will earn negative $45. So it looks like producing 3 units earns you a profit of negative $45. Is there a mistake here? Turns out there is not. No matter what your costs are, looking at the marginal cost determines the highest profit you can obtain in a particular situation. So producing Q equals 3 simply and earning a profit of negative 45 simply means that producing any other amount would yield you even lower profit. For example, if you decided to produce nothing at all, well, you would still have to be paying 90. The fixed cost of production is still there no matter what. So if you decide to, I don't know, rent a building to run an accounting company and you don't have any business at all, well, you're still down by the amount you have to pay to rent the building. If each accounting report that you're creating costs, you get paid $35 for it, you won't cover all your costs, but you still be making some money relative to the $90 that you're losing no matter what. So the principle here is that if production allows you to recover some part of the fixed cost, then you should still be producing even though your profits are negative. Moral here is it's better to produce if revenues cover the variable cost of production. This is the decision for the short run. To see it more clearly, let's look at the following story. When you're producing a positive amount, say Q units of output, you earn revenues of P times Q. This is how much you get for selling those Q units in the market. You incur some variable costs and you pay some fixed cost. If you decide to produce nothing, also known as shutting down, you still have to pay the fixed cost. So the fixed cost should be taken out of consideration when you have to decide how much to produce. And you should shut down if the value of the first two terms on the left, price times quantity minus variable cost, is negative, because then it simply means that you're going down even below the negative fixed cost when you decide to produce. And that happens if the price which you get for your output is below the average variable cost of production. And so thus, the firm's decision in the short run should be as follows. You should shut down if the market price is below your smallest average variable cost. If that is the case, then no matter how much you're deciding to produce, your revenues minus variable costs will be negative, and your profit will be worse than just paying the fixed cost. On the other hand, if price in the market is greater than the minimum average variable cost, you should be producing, although sometimes you might be making negative profit. And the condition for negative profit is if your price is below the average cost, the minimum average cost. So there is a situation in which, in the short run, the firm finds it most profitable to produce, although it's earning negative profits. So its decision in the short run is a little different from shut down if profit is 0, or produce something if it will generate you a positive profit. The decision is shut down if your production does not cover your variable costs, produce if your production covers your variable cost, and you'll be making a positive profit while producing if it happens so that the price exceeds the minimum average cost of your production. So there are 2 points to remember here. There is the shutdown price, the minimum average variable cost, the price beyond which you shouldn't be producing at all in the short run in the market. And then there is the break-even price, price equals to minimum average cost give you a price at which the smallest price at which you're making zero profits. So if the price is high enough, profits are positive. Price falls below the break-even price, you'll be in the negatives, but you should still be producing. Price falls very low below the shutdown price, you should quit and not produce anything at all. This is how firms should operate in the short run. Thank you.